Hello, I'm Marcelino Benito. Thanks for joining us on KHOU 11+. Right now, Robert Roberson's life hangs in the balance. The Texas man was sentenced to death for the 2002 murder of his 2-year-old daughter. Prosecutors say Nikki Curtis died of shaken baby syndrome, but Roberson says he's innocent. So do his lawyers and a growing number of supporters. They say shaken baby syndrome has been discredited and there are other explanations for Nikki's death. Today, we're going to look at some of the back and forth as advocates fight to save Roberson's life. In the days leading up to his execution, scheduled for October 17th, Texas lawmakers kicked off a legal battle that led to unprecedented actions.
For more than 20 years, Robert Roberson sat on death row in Texas, waiting for exoneration or execution. He's now set to face the latter after the state's Board of Pardons and Parole denied his request for clemency.
I am stunned. I am shocked.
At that hearing, Brian Wharton, the lead detective who helped convict Roberson, spoke out in his defense.
I did not see Robert. I did not hear his voice. He's an innocent man, and we are very close to killing him for something he did not do.
In 2003, Roberson was sentenced to death for the killing of his 2-year-old daughter, Nikki. He was accused of fatally shaking her.
Why should people believe that you didn't kill your daughter?
Because I didn't,
At the time of Nikki's death, prosecutors argued that Roberson did not show enough emotion in the hospital, but he was later diagnosed with autism, which his attorneys have argued can make it difficult to express emotion.
Just because I couldn't explain what happened to her, they said you're guilty, and the way I was acting funny because of my autism. I didn't even know I had autism until I was here.
An autopsy later revealed Nikki had pneumonia when she died and had been prescribed opioids. What's more, shaken baby syndrome is now considered junk science. A Texas law is supposed to allow cases where the science has changed to be reconsidered.
The law that the legislature passed and our governor signed into law is being ignored by our courts. All we're seeking to do here is to push the pause button to make sure that it's enforced.
CNN spoke with Roberson on death row, and he explained in his own words what happened that day back in 2002.
Why should people believe that you didn't kill your daughter?
Because I didn't, just like you or me, we can't make a person believers, and stuff, But I carried her to the hospital and stuff, I didn't have nothing to hide.
But you didn't violently shake
No, sir.
your daughter that night?
Never did yell at her, never did violently shake her. All those I was accused of, I never did.
Why do you think you were convicted?
Because I couldn't explain what happened to her. They said you're guilty, and the way I was acting funny because of my autism. I didn't even know I had autism until I was here.
The former lead detective in this case no longer believes Roberson is a guilty man. And after his investigation put Roberson behind bars, Brian Wharton has now spent nearly 10 years working to free him.
Let me just say, Robert is an innocent man. But more than that, he's a kind man. He is a gentle man. He is a gracious man. We did very quickly focus on him, and everything seemed to agree with our focus, to include that which was coming from the hospitals and from the medical professionals that followed us. We were somewhat dependent upon what they told us, and what they told us was shaken baby and there's your man. And so that's the direction everything went, to the exclusion of all other possibilities, really. And so he went to trial on our case. I was very unhappy with the course of the trial in those days. I didn't give voice to it. I was just alone in my thoughts. Robert, his personality, his joy, his hope, that's what comes out. He prays for me every time I'm there. He's a special man, and I'm ashamed that I missed that 20 years ago. We were looking for an offender. We labeled him as such, and we made it stick, all based on junk science. And I can tell you today, he is not an offender. He is completely innocent. And we owe it to him, all of us, not just the witnesses. All of us as citizens of the state of Texas have work to do to right this. These kind of things happen. Innocent people spend time in prison. Innocent people are put to death because the citizenry has gone on about their lives, because we quit caring and we quit paying attention. So please pay attention. And I apologize to him for my role in his being put there and my role in not being able to get him freed from there. And he spoke words of forgiveness to me, which were deeply meaningful to me in the moment. But if the state proceeds, whatever Robert gave me, the state will take away from me, because that death will follow me for the rest of my life.
With just over 24 hours to go until his planned execution, Texas lawmakers took unprecedented steps to try and spare his life. They subpoenaed Roberson to testify in his own case. That hearing date set for nearly a week after he was set to die, and it worked. After a wild back and forth, the Texas Supreme Court halted that execution.
I'm here today to tell you all that Mr. Roberson did receive a stay. I had the opportunity to go back there to speak with him, and he was shocked, to say the least. He praised God and he thanked his supporters. And that's pretty much what we have to say at this time. He'll go back to the Polensky unit, and then we'll proceed from there.
We believe this to be an innocent man where the facts have not come out, and we're hoping this hearing will give that opportunity for the people of Texas to finally hear the facts here. Again, I want to praise the work of the Texas House. Over 80 members, bipartisan coalition from across the spectrum, have worked hard to make sure that this execution did not move forward today, because we want to make sure justice is served. And it's been a strong effort, bipartisan effort. And we're also just so thankful for Robert tonight. As you have been told, he is a man of faith. We both have had the opportunity with some of our colleagues to meet with him, as we did just over 2 weeks ago. As a man of faith, he is so thankful to God for this decision. He's thankful to his supporters that are out there. He's thankful to the Texas House, his lawyer, and everyone else. And he was just joyful tonight. As y'all have heard, that's what we were reported as well. And he knows this isn't over. He wants the truth to come to light, and the Texas House is working to do that. And we hope that the courts and others will follow suit. The Texas House in 2013 and then again in 2015 strengthened the junk science law, referred to as the junk science law. We feel there is fear that it has not been utilized properly in this case and other cases. That is part of what the hearing on Monday is hoping to hear, and we needed Robert to be there as a firsthand account to be able to testify to how it's been used in his case. And it's bigger than him. It's about, is this law that the Texas House, the Texas legislature then signed in 2015 by Governor Abbott, has put into place, is it being implemented properly?
I would love to see him get a new trial. There's so much that a jury has never heard, and that what we learned in the committee hearing yesterday was that there was so much that was thrown out on hearsay, medical experts, things that were not allowed. So he needs a new trial to have all of this properly heard. We are constantly hearing misinformation, false information from people who say they know this case when they clearly do not. And so it is very clear that he needs a new trial, especially as a man with autism, and his experience as a man with autism and going through the court process, even arriving at the hospital, how he was questioned, all of it. It matters when we were talking about this junk science statute and why he was not granted relief under it.
But on the day of Roberson's hearing, he didn't appear in court either in person or virtually. His lawyer explained what happened and what's next for his case.
The suggestion that Robert was a no-show makes it sound like there was some change of heart, and there definitely wasn't. The problem was that the understanding I had when I accepted this subpoena on his behalf was that he would be physically present at the Capitol. And indeed, the next day I had communications with the directors of the prison system who had no problem with this and were even discussing with me ways to make Robert feel comfortable, getting him street clothes he could wear. But I learned Saturday night through media that apparently he was going to come via Zoom, which would have been completely unworkable because of multiple factors, the most prominent of which is that he has severe autism, which affects his ability to communicate. He has a speech impairment, and he has no experience with Zoom from his years of being in solitary confinement on death row. So I objected to this, but it wasn't to him testifying. It was to this switch to an alternative method that, really wasn't going to work and accomplish the mission of assessing his credibility and his demeanor in person. So my anxiety has lowered somewhat. He's still alive. We're still able to fight to be heard in court. But at any moment after this temporary restraining order expires, which I believe is at the end of this month, the local district attorney could go seek a new execution date. And then, as you've noted, the law requires we get at least 91 days notice, but there's no other barrier. It's up to that local district attorney, and she could do that. We genuinely hope that all of the attention brought to the multitude of concerning facts here and all the evidence that has never been considered by any court might cause a pause button to be pressed at that local level. But I don't know. I have not heard anything on that front.
My name is Terry Compton. I was one of the 12 jurors on the case of Robert Roberson's trial, and I took that position very seriously. Everything that was presented to us was all about shaken baby syndrome. That is what our decision was based on. Nothing else was ever mentioned or presented to us to consider. If it had been told to us, I would have had a different opinion, and I would have found him not guilty. But then when I started reading about all these other things coming out about the pneumonia and the sleep apnea and the double pneumonia and all this extra stuff that has just now started to be coming out that I've read about, or maybe it's been out but I just now recently read about, it got me even more thinking, and I started thinking back about all the things that I knew about that went on in the trial, and I just realized, and I just finally came to the conclusion, he was an innocent man. And I just, in good conscience, I could not live with myself thinking that I had a hand in putting an innocent man to death.
Experts also say jurors also lacked key context that Roberson has autism. It's because the diagnosis wasn't made until 2018. Psychologists say Roberson being portrayed as unemotional during the trial made him seem callous and unremorseful.
People on the autism spectrum might seem odd, unemotional, detached, or even uncaring at moments when those people who are neurotypical would expect specific outward emotional reactions. This can be especially true at times of stress. So autism is not a mental illness, a personality disorder, or a behavioral problem. In fact, people with autism like to follow the rules and routines, and they're often honest even when honesty might not be the best approach. Because of their disability, autistic people are 7 times more likely to become involved in the criminal justice system than are people who are neurotypical, meaning they don't have autism. Now, this does not mean that all people with autism exhibit criminal behavior. In fact, they're more likely to be the victims of crime than a perpetrator of crime. But my experience has found innocent people getting involved in the criminal justice system because, like I mentioned, accused perpetrators of crimes, mostly because they react differently to situations than a typical person would. So much of the evidence that the state presented against Mr. Roberson at trial was about manifestations of his then undiagnosed autism. The jury heard witness after witness say Mr. Roberson was odd, uncaring, and unemotional when he brought his daughter to the hospital trying to get her help. For example, a nurse testified that she found it strange he'd gotten his daughter dressed before bringing her to the hospital. Former homicide detective Brian Wharton recalled finding Mr. Robertson's affect disconcerting, saying, quote, "He's not getting mad, he's not getting sad, he's just not right." His reactions were misconstrued as evidence of guilt. the jury was told to believe he was callous and remorseless. So before the 2003 trial, Mr. Roberson had never received any evaluation, diagnosis, or services for autism. Therefore, no one told the jury that his lack of emotional display and his routinized actions, his labored stammer, were products of his disability. Jurors were told to judge him as an unfeeling liar, and they heard no evidence to contextualize his responses. But at a 2018 hearing, the psychologist, Dr. Diane Mosnick, who formally diagnosed Mr. Roberson for the first time that same year, said autism helped explain the misalignment of his feelings and his expressions. So, for example, appearing unemotional at the hospital, also his strong reliance on routine, especially in times of stress, like getting his daughter dressed before he took her to the hospital. Right? That's what you do before a doctor's appointment, and that's what you do every day, and so that's just what he did because it was routine. As an expert in autism diagnosis and treatment, I agree with the diagnosis. The testing showed Mr. Roberson is impaired in all areas of social exchanges, his ability to interpret facial expressions, and his ability to express emotions.
And several famous faces also showing support for Roberson. Talk show host Dr. Phil McGraw and best-selling author John Grisham traveled to Austin to testify on Roberson's behalf.
I believe that in the United States of America, if we are going to deprive someone of their liberty, that comes at a very high standard. If we are going to deprive someone of their life, that comes at a very high standard. A very high standard of proof, a very high standard of evidence, and when you say beyond a reasonable doubt, that's said so much that I think sometimes it can lose its meaning, and we have to really stop and think what that means. That means that if you have 12 people on a jury, that means that there should be nothing that 12 people can go in a room and reasonably disagree about. And that is a high standard, that there should not be anything that they would go in there and say, well, there's nothing here that we can reasonably disagree about. And I think that when we talk about due process and fair trial, that means that all the evidence, everything that is relevant and pertinent to that trial, gets before the trier of fact, whether it be a judge or a jury, and that there's fair representation. And I certainly don't think that standard has been met here, that high standard by which we would deprive someone of their life has been met. If you look at the number of exonerations, it's scary. You're either for the death penalty or not. And if you are for the death penalty, you have to be for doing everything in your power to ensure that those who face that ultimate sentence have had a fair trial and are guilty insofar as we can determine. I mean, you have to do everything. You can't kind of say sort of maybe we've got this right. If you execute people when you now know better, you need to abolish the death penalty. If that's the standard by which you're going to execute people, then you got a bad system.
If we could go back and get a fair trial, and I think that's all Robert and his lawyers would love right now, is to get back into court, have the CCA declare a new trial. Let's go back to Palestine, Texas, to Anderson County, or maybe change venue, whatever, and let's have a legal team that Robert can have with as many lawyers as the prosecution, as many experts as the prosecution, as much money as the prosecution, put the jury in the box, and let's have a fair trial.
Another Texas man with a murder conviction, also tied to shaken baby syndrome, has gotten a new trial. In his case, the court agreed that conviction was based on junk science, and legal experts say Roberson deserves a new and fair trial.
But if we get this case wrong and he's executed, there are no do-overs. And so this case could not be more important.
Tonight, new questions surrounding the fate of Robert Roberson and the science used to convict him for killing his 2-year-old daughter.
I think there's a lot of concern surrounding shaken baby syndrome.
KHOU 11 legal analyst Carmen Roe points to a different case involving an inmate named Andrew Rourke, also convicted of shaking a baby to death. Roe says Rourke's case and Roberson's case are very similar, but points out just this month, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted Rourke a new trial, saying that shaken baby syndrome was a debunked science and that other causes of death could lead a jury to conclude no crime was committed. In legal filings, the court said the original trial experts, quote, would be confronted with 20 years of reputable scientific evidence that contradicts their trial testimony.
The Court of Criminal Appeals just cannot reconcile Rourke's decision saying that shaken baby syndrome is debunked science and Roberson's decision, which denied a new trial based on the same debunked science.
What do you make of the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals making this decision in the Rourke case just days before Roberson was set to be executed?
And I think that there are a number of people, including myself, across the state of Texas that are incredibly troubled by the Court of Criminal Appeals' decision to deny relief, deny any additional hearings or briefing on Mr. Roberson's case, which
Roe also says the House committee hearing on Roberson's case is a result of the Rourke decision. While Roberson did not appear for that committee hearing yesterday, the focus for lawmakers was checking if the courts are correctly implementing Texas's 2013 junk science law.
This is wrong. He needs a new trial, and we need to push pause.
Republican State Representative Lacey Hall of Houston says it's unclear why the Criminal Court of Appeals is applying the law to one case, but not the other.
The statute is clear as to what needs to be done here and how it needs to be followed. The court's just choosing not to do it. We don't want innocent people in prison, and we certainly do not want innocent people executed in Texas.
Family members of Nicky Curtis, Roberson's 2-year-old daughter, have written a letter to the Texas House Committee that stopped his execution, saying they're convinced he's guilty. Nicky's family, including her brother, her aunt, and her grandfather, believe facts have been intentionally left out surrounding this case, reiterating the facts presented in the 2003 trial that Nicky suffered injuries and was allegedly abused by Roberson. They believe that his death sentence should move forward. They said in part, quote, after hearing countless hours of testimony that was presented, we remain convinced that Mr. Roberson is guilty and directly responsible for Nicky's death. We're now joined by KHOU 11 legal analyst Carmen Roe. Carmen, such a complex case here, so many layers to it. Walk us through the logistics of what happens next.
So what happens next is we're looking for a death warrant to be issued by the trial court that originally issued the death warrant that expired on 12:01 a.m. And then we're looking for the possibility of the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reconsidering their denial of his new trial motion and or their denial of his right to even be heard in that court.
So what has to happen for Roberson to get a new trial here?
So the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals has to consider that all of this going on around this case is important enough to actually review it, and or the governor is going to have to give a 30-day reprieve so that we can really develop some of these issues.
What hurdles do you believe have to be cleared for this execution to actually go ahead and move forward?
So a couple of things. One, procedural hurdles in the Court of Criminal Appeals where they've already said we've heard this and we don't need to hear more. But I think this case is so significant because the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals issued that important decision, essentially saying in strong language that shaken baby syndrome is debunked science and that it warrants a new trial in a case that is less serious because it's not a death case.
We know Roberson's legal team has already made several attempts to appeal. Walk us through why you believe they've failed.
I think it has to do with timing. I mean, look, you can talk about a lot of things in this case, but what you have to acknowledge is that the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals wrote a very, very strong opinion with strong language that tells us that they don't believe that science is reliable and that if a new trial were granted for Rourke or for Roberson, that it would be challenged by experts who have a very different opinion today.
So, Carmen, we understand the case was put back in the spotlight in the days leading up to his scheduled execution. Do you recall any similar coverage when the shaken baby syndrome was debunked initially?
No. And I think part of the issue for a lot of people, the reason this committee got involved, the reason that people across the country are coming to Roberson's aid in this moment is because how can it seem fair that you issue an opinion with that kind of language with similar issues to what Roberson is dealing with a week before his execution. And I think there are experts across the country who've been doing this type of work for a really long time, coming to the table and doing everything they can to get him a fair shake.
You mentioned when we were talking off camera that it's not so much about guilt or innocence here, but whether he deserves the opportunity for a new trial. That's the metric.
Sure. So I've been doing this 20 years. I've worked on these types of cases. It's very, very difficult to win. But part of the narrative that's out there in the community is whether or not he's innocent or not. That's not the burden. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals simply says, did he get a fundamentally fair trial? And if he didn't, he deserves a new trial. Whether or not he's guilty or innocent is something that, if as a claim was in front of the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, they could decide it, but really it's going to be for 12 jurors in his community.
And we have heard from the Attorney General in this case, Ken Paxton. He said state legislators interfered by disregarding the separation of powers outlined in the state constitution. I want your assessment on that. Do you find that to be true?
That's a great question. I don't think anybody knows the answer to it. What's so fascinating about that 11th hour stopping of this execution is that it came from a legislative committee, not individuals in the family, and the type of thing we see all the time. So the real question is, does the Texas legislature have the ability to stop an execution when the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals says we move forward? And so the Texas Supreme Court getting involved is something we've never seen before, and the fact that they ultimately stopped an execution is precedent that I'm sure we're going to deal with in the legislature or somewhere else in the near future.
Is how this all unfolded one of the many reasons you believe this is getting so much publicity and interest from the public?
I think that everybody has a sense of fairness about this case. Again, the opinion that was issued by the Court of Criminal Appeals was so unbelievable that it was a week before we execute a man. And let's talk about shaken baby syndrome. This is one of those sciences that has to be put together with all the facts around it. And so when you say it's debunked, I would say this is why we don't execute people for these types of charges. Because when the medical changes, when the science changes, when we know more, we can't take those cases back.
Sure. Texas law, we know, does not allow Roberson's execution to be scheduled for a date earlier than January 15th. By then, we know the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals will have 3 new judges. How will that potentially impact this case? A whole nother layer to that.
Sure, that's huge, because 3 of the 4 judges who voted to execute or not to grant him a new trial will no longer be on Texas's highest court. And so it will be something to look at, whether it's a Democratic person and or a Republican. I think it comes down to party lines. Right now we have 9 Republicans on the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. That's been the case for a long time. So we get 3 more, maybe it changes nothing. Maybe it's the hope that Mr. Roberson needs.
Does this need to be a unanimous vote or not?
No, so the vote is 5-4. That's exactly what the vote was. So there were 5 judges who decided that denying a new trial was okay, and there were 4 judges on the court who said, we think that we should take another look at this case. So it's right down the line.
Well, we know the family is not all on board on whether Roberson is innocent here. We mentioned earlier in the stream how Nikki's brother firmly believes that he's guilty. Walk us through what the other side of the family believes. Not everyone's on the same page on this.
Sure. So the other side of the family filed a letter with the committee that was pretty scathing, that essentially talks about everything except for the science that I think is the most important thing to focus on. They make allegations of abuse. They make allegations of sexual assault. I haven't read this record. I don't know what might be out there. I do know that from the committee hearing, people who know a lot more about it, who did read this transcript from the trial court, said that none of those things occurred. So it's one of those things where maybe he's a bad guy, maybe some of these things are true, but ultimately we need to make sure that he received a fair trial and that this is the right result before we move forward. And I think everyone has questions that have not been answered, not even in that committee.
I want to be clear, though, there are some members of Roberson's family who do believe he's innocent, right?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of support for him and his family, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that Nikki apparently was a very sick little girl. She was sick most of her life leading up to her death. How do we know this? From all the information that's out there and what was told to us in that hearing. all of that plays directly into what was the cause of her death, and that goes to the medical and the scientific testimony.
So I do want to get your take on one of the most recent developments, again, we were talking about before we started rolling. It's sort of turned into a scandal of sorts. I think it's fair to use that word. We now know a Texas lawmaker, Jeff Leach, sent text messages to a friend, Michelle Slaughter, who just happens to be a sitting judge on the Criminal Court of Appeals. So walk us through the significance of what's happening here.
Look, this is a big deal. First of all, it may be a Texas disciplinary violation for an attorney, which Mr. Leach is, to reach out to a judge in a pending matter, or if the matter may have something pending in the future. The other thing to keep in mind, I think it speaks to how desperate that committee is in telling this high court that this is a fundamentally unfair execution and that we all need to take a step back before moving forward.
Judge Slaughter will ultimately have a vote on this then?
Well, no, she won't. So she's one of the judges who did vote to execute, but she will not be on the court as of January 1. And so another judge will be in that seat to make those decisions.
All right. Well, it's a case we'll continue to follow very closely. Thank you, Carmen, for your expertise. And thank you for watching this KHOU 11 Plus special. You'll be able to watch this on demand as well.